There was a peculiar sort of stillness over the village of Little Wharton that Saturday afternoon. One of those deceptively tranquil English days when the hedgerows seemed trimmed to perfection and the air held the faint sweetness of ripening pears. Children skipped between bunting flags, the vicar fussed over the raffle table, and the parish ladies arranged cakes with a seriousness usually reserved for diplomacy. It was the annual garden fete at St. Mildred's, an event so regular in its routine it might have been mistaken for timeless. Miss Jane Marple, visiting her distant cousin Adelaide Burrows for a fortnight's rest, sat beneath a white parasol, hands gently folded around a straw handbag. She was watching everything, the way she always did, with mild, bird-like interest. Not intrusively, of course. Miss Marple never intruded. She merely noticed. From her vantage point, she observed Colonel Hugh Davenport, retired and twice decorated, puffing importantly as he carried a tray of onion tartlets no one had asked him to help with. Mrs. Lydia Fenton, the doctor's young wife, attempting unsuccessfully to hide her agitation behind polite smiles. Peter Lyle, the Fate's treasurer, counting ticket stubs with almost obsessive care. Nora Blackwell, whose rose cake had won first prize 3 years running, glaring daggers at any competitor who came near the judging tent. All perfectly ordinary people, Miss Marple mused. And yet she had known enough villages, enough fates, committees, jam contests, and social niceties to recognize that beneath every polite smile was a brewing storm or two. Still, she did not expect a storm, quite literally or figuratively, until it arrived. The first crack in the calm came when Mrs. Adelaide Burrows herself bustled toward Miss Marple, pink-faced and flustered. "Jane, dear," she whispered urgently, "it's Mr. Wilfred Channing, the solicitor. He hasn't arrived to judge the handwriting competition, and you know how impossible he is about punctuality. I'm dreadfully concerned something's gone amiss." Miss Marple gave a light, placid smile. "Perhaps he merely lost track of time, Adelaide. Solicitors are notorious for placing clocks second to paperwork." But even as she said it, a ripple of unease passed through the fete. It began at the refreshments table, moved into the quilting tent, then spread like spilled ink among the crowd. Heads turned, voices hushed. Colonel Davenport was the one to voice it aloud. "Good heavens! Someone fetch the doctor!" The commotion surged toward the lane bordering the church grounds, where an abandoned bicycle lay half-tipped against the low stone wall. A small group had already formed, and Miss Marple, rising with gentle purpose, followed in their wake. There, lying beside the bicycle on the gravel verge, was Mr. Wilfred Channing. His normally precise, starched appearance was in disarray. His spectacles were cracked beside him. One hand clutched the handlebar as though he had tried to steady himself, and his face, pale, oddly peaceful, suggested that whatever had taken him had come with unexpected swiftness. Dr. Fenton knelt beside the body. Mrs. Fenton looked away, trembling. After a long moment, the doctor rose, brushing dust from his trousers. "I'm afraid Mr. Channing is dead," he announced gravely. "A heart attack, most likely." A murmur spread through the gathering crowd, shock mingling with fascination. So sudden, so unexpected, yet an accident one could, in theory, understand. A man cycling to a fate, struck down by nature's whim. Almost everyone accepted that explanation at once. Almost. Miss Marple, who had bent to retrieve the cracked spectacles, turned them once in her gloved hand. There was something, just a whisper of irregularity, in the way the gravel had scattered, the bicycle's position, the angle of Mr. Channing's arm. Nothing certain, just a quiet stirring of intuition. As the villagers whispered theories and condolences, Miss Marple looked once more at the peaceful English scene. The bunting fluttering in the mild wind, the sound of distant laughter, the kettle boiling somewhere in the tea-tent. To the casual eye, tragedy had simply and sadly intruded upon an otherwise lovely day, But Miss Marple never relied on the casual eye. And something about Mr. Wilfred Channing's death did not look quite as ordinary as everyone believed. The first sharp cry of distress, once uttered, seemed to loosen the tongues of everyone present. Within minutes of Dr. Fenton's pronouncement, the garden fete at St. Mildred's had ceased to be an occasion of raffles and sponge cakes and had transformed into something far more compelling, a stage upon which grief, curiosity, and a slightly indecorous thrill of drama were now to be displayed. Mrs. Adelaide Burrows, who prided herself on maintaining composure in any circumstance, having once asserted she'd only faint for a royal beheading or the second coming, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief as she shepherded people away from the lane. "Please, everyone, give the doctor some space. Poor Mr. Channing. Such a shock. Do have some tea, Mrs. Welby. You look quite pale." Mrs. Welby, who looked anything but pale and everything like a woman who had at last obtained something intensely interesting to talk about, allowed herself to be guided toward the tea tent. "Of course, Adelaide, dear, of course," she murmured, already rehearsing the cadence of how she would later relate every detail to her sister in Upper Bexton. A solicitor, dead on the lane, on fete day, in full view of half the parish. It was, though she would never say so aloud, deliciously sensational. Within a quarter of an hour, groups formed and reformed around the lawns, much as the drifting of clouds alters the patterns of light on the grass. At one table, Colonel Davenport was declaiming with unnecessary volume as though addressing troops. "Always said the man worked too hard," he announced, thumping his fist down near the sugar bowl. "Overexertion. These chaps sit at desks all day, fussing over papers and signatures. No stamina. That's modern life for you." At another table, Mrs. Nora Blackwell sat stiffly, her carefully coiffed hair not daring to move even as her lips pinched into a thin line. "I don't see how they can be so certain it was his heart," she said, pouring herself another cup of tea. "My uncle had a heart attack, and he went quite purple. Mr. Channing didn't look purple at all. He looked, well, rather as if he'd just decided to lie down." Beside her, young Peter Lyle twisted a raffle ticket between his fingers until it tore. As treasurer, he knew he ought to be recounting the fate's earnings. Instead, his mind kept returning to the image on the gravel verge, the bicycle tilted, the cracked spectacles. He had never seen a dead man before. It unnerved him. "The doctor said heart," he murmured, not entirely sure if he was reassuring Nora or himself. Doctors know these things." Nora let out a soft, doubtful sniff. "Doctors do their best, I'm sure. But I should like to know why he fell there, exactly there of all places. He cycles that lane every day, I'm told. Why not last week or the week before?" Miss Marple, who had quietly joined their table with the unobtrusiveness of someone shuffling a chair a fraction closer, smiled faintly into her cup. "It is interesting," she said mildly, "how events choose their moments, isn't it? One might almost say they have a sense of occasion." Peter glanced at her, puzzled. To his mind, Miss Marple was simply a frail elderly lady with a pleasant, unremarkable face and a tendency to knit during conversations. She did not look like someone who would notice the position of a bicycle wheel under a hedge, or the scattering of gravel beneath a fallen man's heel. "What do you mean, Miss Marple, is it?" Nora asked, curiosity pricking at her even as her fingers smoothed an invisible wrinkle from the tablecloth. "Oh, nothing very profound, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "Only that people quite often collapse at the most inconvenient times. I remember a dear friend of my mother's many years ago in St. Mary Mead. She had a weak heart, you know, and everyone expected, quite naturally, that she would go quietly in her sleep. Instead, she chose to do so in the middle of the harvest Thanksgiving, right as the vicar was beginning his sermon. Very awkward for the collection, I recall. There was a ripple of polite, if uneasy, laughter. Still, Miss Marple went on, stirring her tea with inconsequential calm, even when something appears quite in character, Like a heart giving out, it can sometimes be the setting that tells you most. People seldom leave this world in a way that doesn't, in some fashion, reflect how they lived in it. Mr. Channing, for instance, must have led a life with very particular connections. Solicitors so often do. She let the remark drift into the air like a feather, light enough to seem accidental. It was Nora who pounced on it first. "Well, that's certainly true," she said. "He knew everyone's business by all accounts. Wills, mortgages, agreements. Lydia Fenton told me once. No, I dare say I shouldn't repeat it." "Perhaps you shouldn't," Peter said quickly, though his eyes leveled with a kind of desperate interest. "But everyone's thinking similar things anyway. When a man like that dies suddenly, it does make you wonder if something unpleasant was hanging over him." Nora's gaze slid toward the far end of the lawn, where Lydia Fenton stood with her husband. The doctor was speaking in low tones to a few men, presumably about arrangements for removing the body. Lydia's hands twisted together, unraveling and retwisting the straps of her handbag. "It's poor Lydia I feel for," Nora said. "She's quite shaken. She and Mr. Channing were seen deep in conversation outside the surgery only yesterday afternoon. I happened to be passing and, well, one notices things." She looked upset. He, on the other hand, looked like a man, putting pressure on. "Pressure?" Miss Marple repeated softly. "You know the sort of look, Miss Marple. Lips tight, eyes narrowed, whole bearing just that little bit too confident." Nora took a sip of tea, her eyes narrowing at the memory. "Of course, I'm not suggesting anything improper, but people do get themselves into all sorts of difficulties. Financial, personal, legal." Miss Marple nodded, her expression faintly sympathetic. "Yes," she said, "and those sorts of difficulties have a habit of lingering in the background, like a smudge on glass. One doesn't always see the smudge at first, but it's there." Across the lawn, Colonel Davenport marched past, his military mustache quivering. "I've sent word to the police," he barked in general. "Formality, of course, but they must be notified. Village or no village, a sudden death must be properly recorded." The mention of the police added a new spice to the rapidly thickening stew of speculation. Some were reassured by it. Others, curiously, seemed unsettled. Mrs. Welby announced she would absolutely faint if men in uniforms tramped all over the vicar's herbaceous border. The vicar, overhearing, began to fret about jurisdiction, as though the constable might confiscate the church raffle. Miss Marple watched all of this without appearing to. Her gaze slid briefly to the edge of the fete, where the lane curved out of sight. The image of the bicycle returned to her mind, its back wheel slightly buckled, its front wheel not quite parallel with the hedge. A small thing, perhaps. Bicycles fell untidily all the time, yet she had noticed, too, the faint impression in the gravel where Mr. Channing's body had landed, and the way one of his shoes bore a smear of what looked like damp earth rather than dust. Damp earth, when the lane itself had been dry as powder. In St. Mary Mead, she had once seen a similar misalignment between circumstance and detail. A man had fallen down the stairs after a quarrel with his wife. Everyone had agreed it must be an accident until Miss Marple noticed the direction in which his slippers had flown. One slipper, she always said, could tell quite a long story, if one only asked it. Now, in Little Wharton, it seemed possible that a bicycle might do the same. "Do you think the fate will be stopped now, Miss Marple?" Peter asked suddenly. "It doesn't seem right to go on." "Oh, but life does go on, Mr. Lyle," Miss Marple said gently. "Even in the most distressing circumstances. People still need their tea, and the church still needs its funds, and—" She hesitated, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Sometimes, continuing as normally as possible allows one to see who is most unsettled by the idea." He frowned. "I don't follow." "Why, those who have lost more than a judge for a handwriting competition," she replied. "Death is very rarely an isolated event, you know. It tends to tug at threads that are already frayed. A small commotion at the entrance to the churchyard drew their attention. The arrival of the village constable, Sergeant Briggs, stout and tidy in his uniform, cheeks flushed from hurrying. He spoke briefly with Dr. Fenton and then disappeared toward the lane. Nora leaned closer, her voice dropping to an excited whisper. There'll be questions now. Statements, perhaps. I shouldn't be surprised if they start asking who last saw Mr. Channing alive, or whether anyone had disagreements with him. Peter looked suddenly uncomfortable. Nearly everyone in the district has had some sort of disagreement with him, he muttered. Solicitors make their living out of other people's disputes. He was handling the sale of Old Mill Cottage for my aunt. There have been delays, sharp letters. I dare say half the village could be described as having a grievance. How very fertile, Miss Marple murmured. Such ground often grows more than one sort of plant. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. She merely folded her hands and watched, her expression that of an elderly lady paying mild attention to the continuation of the fete. Yet within her mind, the threads had already begun to form a pattern. A highly respected but unpopular solicitor, a young wife seen in distress, villagers with grievances large and small, a body that had chosen an oddly public stage for its collapse. The official line would be simple enough. Heart failure, unfortunate, but hardly extraordinary. Miss Marple, however, had learned long ago that what everyone accepted too quickly was often precisely what needed to be examined more closely. As the tea flowed and the whispers thickened, she resolved, quietly and without any fuss, to learn a little more about Mr. Wilfred Channing and the lives he had so tidily entangled on a paper. The constable's presence cast a subtle but unmistakable shift over the fete. Though the bunting still fluttered in its cheerful colors and the scent of buttered scones lingered in the air, conversation grew more subdued, and every laugh, when it came at all, sounded slightly forced. A death, especially one so sudden, had a way of traveling into the corners of people's minds and tugging at things they might rather leave untouched. Sergeant Briggs soon emerged from the lane, jotting something in a small notebook. He walked with the deliberate briskness of a man who wished to appear highly competent, though Miss Marple noted that his brow was furrowed a little more deeply than the situation might demand. Dr. Fenton accompanied him, speaking in hushed tones, and from the set of the sergeant's jaw, it was clear he was trying to balance respect for the doctor's opinion with the prickling sense that something about the incident warranted a closer look. Around them, the fete limped on. Mrs. Burrows insisted, somewhat desperately, that the scone judging continue, for she could not abide disorder. Colonel Davenport, naturally, declared this the proper British response to tragedy, to show fortitude by carrying on. But people watched the constable out of the corners of their eyes, as though waiting for his movements to reveal some greater truth. Miss Marple observed all of this while knitting. She had produced her needles from her handbag the moment the tension thickened, as if the quiet rhythm of wool and steel offered balance to the unsettled air. No one suspected, as she knitted a row of perfect little loops, that she was simultaneously gathering each loose thread of human behavior and tucking it into the developing tapestry of the mystery. It was Lydia Fenton who drew her attention next. The young woman had drifted to the edge of the lawn, standing half-concealed behind a table of preserves. Her face was pale, her hands twisting nervously in the folds of her summer dress. Miss Marple watched her for a long moment, watched the way Lydia's eyes kept darting toward the lane, as if afraid of someone emerging from it. Miss Marple's knitting slowed, then stopped completely. There was a particular look people had when they were frightened not by death itself, but by what the death might bring into the open. Lydia Fenton had that look. After a few moments of quiet consideration, Miss Marple rose from her chair. Her knees, though not what they had been, carried her with steady grace toward the young woman. "My dear," she said softly as she approached. "You seem in need of a little air." Lydia jumped, startled. "Miss Marple! Oh, you frightened me. I didn't see you coming." "One rarely does," Miss Marple replied with a faint smile. "A habit of mine, I'm afraid. Too many years slipping between vicarage tables and garden hedges." Lydia attempted a smile, but it faltered. "It's all so dreadful. Mr. Channing, he was here only yesterday, perfectly healthy, and now—" She trailed off, swallowing. "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "It is always quite a shock, especially if one saw him recently, as you did." A pink flush rose on Lydia's cheeks. "Who told you that?" "Oh, my dear, no one needed to." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "One learns to notice when two people have been speaking in earnest, and I gather it was indeed earnest." Lydia hesitated, looking torn between confession and self-preservation. It was nothing improper," she said finally, her voice trembling. "But Mr. Channing had been handling a matter for me. Something personal. He said there might be complications." "Did he worry you?" Lydia's eyes filled almost instantly, though she blinked the tears back with the practiced restraint of someone determined not to cause a scene. "He wasn't unkind," she whispered. "Just stern, rather forceful. I suppose he meant well. But he implied that if things weren't resolved soon, Lionel and it could become difficult." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Financial difficulties?" A pause. "No," Lydia said softly. "Not financial." Her gaze drifted toward her husband, who was speaking to Sergeant Briggs with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to precise conclusions. And in that fleeting moment, Miss Marple caught it. A flicker of fear, yes, but also something sharper, something Lydia was careful not to name. Before Miss Marple could ask further, a sudden burst of voices near the refreshment tent caught their attention. Peter Lyle, flustered and crimson-faced, was being confronted by Nora Blackwell. "Don't play innocent," Nora was saying, her voice pitched low enough to avoid scandal but high enough to draw interest. "You had dealings with him too, didn't you? Everyone knew you were anxious about the delay in your aunt's sale." Peter stammered, pushing his hands through his hair. "It wasn't like that. Yes, I'd been frustrated, but I didn't wish him, no one would wish him dead." "That's not what I said," Nora replied, eyes sharp. "But delays can be costly, and your aunt's finances aren't exactly—" She let the implication trail off with impeccable timing. Miss Marple watched the exchange closely. Nora Blackwell was a woman who prided herself on appearances, particularly her own. Her precise coiffure, immaculate dress, and competitive streak in all matters domestic suggested someone who cared very much about maintaining her place in the social hierarchy. Gossip, for Nora, was both a weapon and a shield. But this particular bit of gossip felt unusually pointed. Others were listening now. Mrs. Welby leaned in, as though her neck might stretch of its own accord. Colonel Davenport huffed indignantly about decorum. Even Adelaide Burrows, bless her, looked torn between intervening and letting the drama spice up her otherwise orderly fate. Peter's voice shook. "I didn't argue with him yesterday, if that's what you're implying. I wasn't even in the village." "Is that so?" Nora asked innocently. "Because someone saw you cycling down the lane just before luncheon. That is the same lane Mr. Channing was found on." Peter stared at her, stunned. "That's impossible. Who told you?" But Nora merely lifted her chin, refusing to elaborate. Miss Marple noted Peter's trembling hands, the restless shifting of his weight, the panic not of guilt, but of a young man suddenly thrust beneath the narrowing lens of public suspicion. Suspicion, Miss Marple knew, could grow as swiftly as ivy, first a small tendril, then a creeping vine that wrapped itself around anything unfortunate enough to be nearby. She also knew that the truth seldom belonged to the first person who spoke it. Sergeant Briggs, having overheard enough to look concerned, made his way toward the pair, notebook ready. Peter's expression grew more miserable by the second. This, Miss Marple decided, was a perfect time to intervene. Not to manipulate, but to prevent the investigation from latching prematurely onto a convenient target. She approached with her usual gentle air. "Sergeant," she said, her voice warm enough to suggest harmlessness, yet steady enough to command attention, "you might consider asking Mr. Lyle about his aunt's health. She's been rather frail lately, I'm told. It would hardly be surprising if he visited her unexpectedly." Peter stared at Miss Marple with something like bewildered relief. Nora's lips thinned. Sergeant Briggs blinked. He had not known Miss Marple long, but he had already sensed that she was a woman who observed more than she appeared to. "Is that so, Mr. Lyle?" he asked, pen poised. Peter nodded quickly. Yes, I went to her cottage early this morning. She wasn't well." "Well then," the sergeant said, clearly unsure whether his line of inquiry had been sharpened or blunted, "we'll get a full account shortly." Miss Marple stepped back, allowing the scene to settle. She had not offered Peter a lie, merely an avenue through which facts could be clarified without the pressure of half the village watching. But as she resumed her knitting, she considered something far more important. Nora's certainty that Peter had been seen on the lane. Nora was not careless with her claims. The question then was who had told her, and why. A small detail, yes, but small details had a way of becoming pivot points in a mystery. Lydia Fenton, still hovering at the margins, shot Miss Marple a fleeting look of gratitude, or perhaps it was recognition that Miss Marple understood more than she let on. The fate continued, but an unseen weight had settled upon the lawn. Death, real death, not the kind spoken of in hushed hypotheticals, had roots spreading beneath the surface now, and as people whispered, lied, and speculated, Miss Marple knitted quietly, the pattern of wool mirroring the pattern forming in her mind. Something was amiss in Little Wharton, and if the villagers believed Mr. Channing's death would fade into the background like a faint stain on linen, they were very much mistaken. For already the threads were tightening. The fete wound down slowly, as if reluctant to acknowledge that its cheer had been irreparably spoiled. Stalls were packed away more quietly than usual, and even the children, still rosy from races and sweetmeats, seemed to sense that laughter was no longer quite appropriate. People drifted off in pairs or small groups, ensuring they were observed leaving at respectable times, each hoping to overhear just one more tidbit before returning to the privacy of home, where speculation could flourish unchecked. Miss Marple lingered near the trestle tables, folding her knitting neatly into her bag. She had no intention of leaving until the ripples of the day had settled enough for her to see the currents beneath. Indeed, it was just as she was fastening the clasp of her handbag that she noticed Lydia Fenton slipping away from the lawn, moving swiftly toward the gate that led to the side path behind the church. The young woman kept her gaze low, avoiding both congregated villagers and her own husband's line of sight. Miss Marple, being a great believer in the value of unobtrusive observation, took a moment to adjust her hat before following at a leisurely pace. The side path was screened by a row of flourishing yew hedges, their dense greenery forming a natural corridor that dulled all outside noise. Lydia had stopped halfway down, leaning one hand against the stone wall as though steadying herself. Her face, though composed from a distance, revealed deep cracks of distress at closer vantage. Miss Marple approached with the soft tread of someone accustomed to blending into the edges of scenes. "My dear," she said quietly, "you mustn't stand here alone. It gives the impression you are hiding, and people in villages are very quick to ask why." Lydia turned sharply, eyes wide. "Miss Marple, I didn't hear you. I'm sorry, it's just everything today has been so overwhelming." "It has," Miss Marple agreed, "and overwhelming events often press upon us most when we attempt to keep our thoughts contained. A private moment can sometimes do more harm than good." Lydia let out a breath that trembled at the edges. "You think I'm behaving suspiciously?" "My dear," Miss Marple replied gently, "I think you are afraid. And fear is something I've known in many forms over the years. It often appears in precisely the sort of posture you now hold, shoulders drawn, hands clenched, eyes watching without wishing to be seen." Lydia's composure faltered. "I don't know what you've guessed," she whispered, her voice cracking. "But Mr. Channing's death, it complicates matters terribly." Miss Marple did not move closer. She knew enough of frightened young women to understand that distance sometimes encouraged confession better than comfort. "Then perhaps," she suggested, "you might tell me what troubles you before your fears grow larger than the truth." For a moment, Lydia hesitated. Her gaze drifted back toward the fete grounds, now nearly deserted, then to the lane where Mr. Channing's body had been taken away. At last, with a visible shudder, she spoke. "It was about a document," she said softly. "A legal document Mr. Channing insisted needed my signature. He said it affected Lionel's practice. Something about liability and responsibilities. I didn't fully understand it. But when I hesitated..." She swallowed, the memory tightening her features. "He became insistent, almost threatening." "Threatening how, exactly?" Lydia pressed a hand to her throat. "He said that if I didn't sign promptly, Lionel's professional standing could be damaged. That mistakes had been made, mistakes Mr. Channing had covered for before, and that another such incident would be disastrous." Miss Marple let this settle. "Did you tell your husband?" "No." Lydia's voice was tinged with sudden urgency. "Lionel worries enough about the practice. I didn't want him to think I doubted him, and Mr. Channing said it would be better if Lionel didn't know until everything was sorted." Miss Marple's brows lifted a fraction. How very convenient for Mr. Channing. That struck Lydia visibly. "You think he had ulterior motives?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that men who rely on pressure usually have more than one reason for applying it, and a solicitor privy to confidential information can often use it to his own advantage. Whether Mr. Channing was doing so, I cannot yet say, but it is worth considering what he gained from urging you so strongly." Before Lydia could respond, footsteps sounded at the end of the path. Sergeant Briggs appeared, hat tucked beneath one arm. His round face was pink with the effort of a long afternoon. "Mrs. Fenton," he said, clearing his throat, "I'm sorry to trouble you, but I should like to ask a few questions. Routine, of course." Lydia tensed immediately, but Miss Marple offered her a reassuring nod before turning to Briggs with a pleasant smile. "Sergeant, you mustn't overtax the poor girl," she said cheerfully. "She has had quite a strain today. Perhaps," and here she gave him a very specific, meaningful glance, "you might begin with Mrs. Blackwell. She seems quite eager to offer information." Briggs blinked, momentarily disoriented by the sudden shift in suggestion. "Mrs. Blackwell?" "Oh yes," Miss Marple said lightly. "She has been making rather confident assertions about who was where and when this morning. I dare say she has collected a great deal of material for you." The sergeant was not a foolish man. He recognized a well-placed nudge when he heard one. "Ah, yes, quite." He adjusted his hat. "Mrs. Fenton, I'll return shortly. Please don't distress yourself." As he moved away, Lydia released a long, trembling breath. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "why did you do that?" "Because, my dear, you are not ready to speak with him. And a statement given prematurely can be rather like an ink blot on a page. It obscures more than it clarifies." Lydia stared at her with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. "Do you believe Mr. Channing was harmed? Deliberately?" Miss Marple gave her a long, measured look. "I believe," she said softly, "that a man who has spent years involving himself in the private affairs of nearly everyone in the community is seldom without enemies. And when such a man dies inconveniently, on fete day, on a public lane, on his way to judge a trivial competition, it would be imprudent to dismiss the possibility of human intention. The wind stirred the hedges, carrying faint echoes of the fete's final clean-up. Tables being folded, chairs stacked, distant murmurs of villagers retelling the day's events, with embellishments already growing. Lydia's voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. If someone hated him enough to do something terrible, could that be connected to what he asked me to sign? It might, Miss Marple said gently. Or it might not. But what he pressured you to do suggests he held knowledge that could influence many lives. And influence, she added with quiet certainty, is a currency some would go to great lengths to protect or to silence. Lydia shivered. What should I do? For now, Miss Marple advised, go home. Stay close to your husband. Say as little as possible to others until you understand more. And if anything more occurs to you, any conversation, any detail, no matter how insignificant it may seem, you must tell me. Lydia nodded shakily and hurried down the path toward the parish gate. Miss Marple watched her go, then turned her gaze to the softening sky, where early evening shadows stretched across the grass. She remained still for a moment, letting the fragments of the day arrange themselves in her mind. The solicitor's insistence, Lydia's fear, Nora Blackwell's oddly specific accusations, Peter's sudden entanglement in suspicion, and beneath it all, the quiet, unassuming truth that Mr. Wilfred Channing had been a man whose knowledge of others' secrets made him both indispensable and resented. As she made her way back toward Adelaide Burrows, who was fussing over the packing of teacups with the desperation of someone trying to impose order on chaos, Miss Marple felt the faint, unmistakable stirrings of certainty. Someone in Little Wharton had wanted Mr. Channing silenced, and if the smallest clues already whispered as much, then the larger truths were waiting just beneath the surface, eager to be uncovered, but only if one knew precisely where to look. As the last remnants of the fete were cleared away, the village settled into the peculiar quiet that follows an unexpected tragedy. The soft glow of lanterns being extinguished one by one gave the churchyard a solemn air, as though even the buildings understood something grave had occurred. Miss Marple walked with Adelaide Burrows toward the vicarage gate, allowing Adelaide to chatter anxiously about table linens and the correct storage of surplus jam jars. Beneath the flurry of domestic worries, however, her cousin's voice trembled with something deeper. "It's such a dreadful thing, Jane," Adelaide murmured. "I can't help wondering, did he suffer terribly?" "Oh, I do hope not. And then all this gossip springing up before the poor man's even been properly taken care of. People ought to be ashamed." "People seldom are, dear," Miss Marple said mildly. "Grief unsettles them. Suspicion does the rest." Adelaide paused at the gate, wringing her hands. "Do you think the police will decide it's more than a heart attack? I hardly slept last night thinking of it." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her cousin's arm. "Worrying won't hasten any conclusions. These things unfold as they must." In truth, Miss Marple felt that the unfolding had already begun, and not in a direction as straightforward as the villagers hoped. As she made her way to Adelaide's guest room that night, she reviewed each detail with quiet precision: the bicycle's odd position, Lydia's distress, Nora's too eager insinuations, Peter's hasty defensiveness. These were not yet pieces of a full picture, but they were hints, shadows cast by motives not yet confessed. The next morning brought no less tension. Villagers, having slept poorly, emerged early to walk their dogs or fetch milk from the dairy, each hoping, for reasons both human and unspoken, to cross paths with someone who might know more. Even the robins seemed subdued, singing half-heartedly from the hedgerows. Miss Marple joined Adelaide for breakfast, nibbling toast as her cousin sifted through the local newspaper with the thoroughness of a customs inspector. "There's nothing in here about Mr. Channing," Adelaide said, sounding faintly disappointed. "The paper goes to print on Fridays," Miss Marple reminded her. "By next week I dare say his name will feature rather prominently." Before Adelaide could answer, The front gate clattered and Sergeant Briggs appeared, removing his hat with stiff politeness. He asked for a few minutes of Miss Marple's time, and she accompanied him to the parlor, where sunlight slanted through lace curtains. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he began, perched on the sofa's edge like a schoolboy awaiting examination results. "It's just that the doctor isn't entirely satisfied with calling Channing's death natural." Miss Marple nodded. "Dr. Fenton is a careful man." "Quite. Said there was nothing obviously violent, but certain inconsistencies." The sergeant cleared his throat. "I've sent for the county inspector, standard protocol when there's any uncertainty." "That seems wise." Briggs hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Between you and me, Miss Marple, the villagers are already talking as though I've named a suspect." "I assure you I haven't." "Rumor is often faster than fact," Miss Marple replied, "and far less accurate." He sighed. "Mrs. Blackwell claims she has important information. She's been to the station twice this morning already." "Has she?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes lighting with mild interest. "And what does she believe she knows?" The sergeant rubbed his brow. "She says she heard an argument yesterday evening near the solicitor's office. Claims one voice sounded like Peter Lyle's, but when I pressed her, she couldn't describe what was said. Only that it was heated." "How fortunate," Miss Marple said gently, "to overhear heat without hearing content." He gave a weary grunt. "Quite. I'd value your sense of things, Miss Marple. You notice more than most." She folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Sergeant, you must be patient. People withhold truths for many reasons: fear, pride, guilt that may not even relate to the death in question. Be wary of those who volunteer too much too soon." Briggs nodded slowly. "Mrs. Blackwell does strike one as eager." Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet smile. "Eagerness is often a sign of someone hoping to guide the narrative rather than reveal it." Before Briggs could respond, footsteps sounded on the gravel path outside. The parlor window offered a clear view of Lydia Fenton approaching the house, her posture straighter than yesterday, though tension lingered in her expression. "I should like to speak with her," Miss Marple said, "if you don't mind." Briggs stood, straightening his jacket. "Of course, I'll leave you to your conversation." He slipped out the back door as Lydia reached the front step. The young woman entered hesitantly, glancing around as though expecting someone to leap from behind the wallpaper. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice tight, I remembered something. About yesterday. It may be nothing, but it won't leave my mind." Miss Marple gestured her to sit. Nothing important ever leaves the mind so persistently. Lydia perched on the edge of a chair. "I didn't tell you everything yesterday. After Mr. Channing spoke to me outside the surgery, someone else approached him." Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. "Someone else?" "Yes, Nora Blackwell." A soft, thoughtful hum escaped Miss Marple. "What did you see?" Lydia shook her head helplessly. "I didn't hear their words, but Nora was very agitated. Her hands were trembling, and Mr. Channing," he looked amused, almost smug, as though he had said something she couldn't refute. "And they parted on good terms." "Not at all. Nora stormed off. Mr. Channing watched her go with that superior expression he sometimes wore. Then he cycled away." Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle clacking, each stitch falling into place like a developing theory. "You've done very well to recall that, Lydia. Very well indeed." "But does it mean anything?" Lydia asked anxiously. "People argue all the time." "They do," Miss Marple agreed. "But not everyone argues with a man the day before he dies in puzzling circumstances. And not everyone seeks to control the story of his death so early." Lydia's eyes widened. "You think Nora—" "I think," Miss Marple said mildly, "that Nora Blackwell is accustomed to appearing perfectly composed. When people like that find themselves entangled in scandal, they tend to act swiftly before anyone can ask questions they are not prepared to answer." The faint sound of wheels crunching on gravel drew Lydia's attention. Through the window, a black motor car approached, the kind used by county authorities. "The inspector," she whispered. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. Matters will progress more formally now, but formal inquiries often shine light on things villagers hoped would remain dim." Lydia clasped her hands. "Miss Marple, what if something terrible does come out?" "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "terrible things seldom remain hidden forever, and when a man like Mr. Channing dies unexpectedly, the truths he carried often rise to the surface, whether those around him wish them to or not." Lydia stood slowly, her breath unsteady. "I'll go home. Lionel will be expecting me." As she left, Miss Marple watched the inspector step out of the motor car, briefcase in hand, posture crisp with authority. His arrival marked a new stage, one in which speculation would be met with structured questions, and secrets long buried in Little Wharton might begin to crumble beneath professional scrutiny. Yet Miss Marple knew something the inspector did not. Mysteries in small villages were never solved by force of authority alone. They were solved by watching the smallest movements, listening to the quietest whispers, and understanding the ways human nature revealed itself in moments of pressure. And the pressure in Little Wharton was only beginning to build. Inspector Armitage's arrival did not go unnoticed by the villagers. Within an hour of his stepping out of the black motor car, Little Wharton had shifted into an entirely new mode of speculation, one tinted now with the authority of official scrutiny. Curtains twitched, doors opened just wide enough for whispers to pass through before closing again. People hurried about with the self-conscious air of those determined not to appear as though they were hurrying at all. The inspector, a tall, straight-backed man with a clipped mustache and eyes that missed very little, wasted no time. After speaking briefly with Sergeant Briggs and Dr. Fenton, he requested access to the lane where Mr. Channing had fallen. Several villagers craned their necks from a respectable distance as the three men walked the narrow stretch of gravel, stopping often while the inspector knelt to examine something or made succinct notes. Miss Marple, from her seat on Adelaide Burrow's front terrace, watched with the calm patience of someone who understood that investigations conducted in broad daylight rarely revealed their true heart. It was in private conversations, unguarded moments, that truth tended to peek out like a startled mouse. Adelaide, bustling with emotional energy, was less composed. "I do hope the inspector doesn't think there has been foul play," she fretted, pouring tea in a manner that sloshed dangerously near the rim of the cup. "It would be dreadful for the village's reputation." "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "reputations are far more resilient than one imagines. What suffers most in situations like this is usually the truth, buried under layers of anxiety and supposition." Adelaide sighed, stirring sugar with unnecessary vigor. "I just want everything to be settled." "It will be," Miss Marple replied, "though perhaps not in the way the villagers expect." Her attention drifted toward the lane again. The inspector had paused beside the hedge where the bicycle had lain the day before. Dr. Fenton pointed to something on the ground, and the inspector bent low, studying it with evident interest. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. She could not see the object, but she suspected it was that same damp earth smear she had noticed on Mr. Channing's shoe, a detail the doctor, too observant to overlook it, must have found curious. A few minutes later, the men walked back toward the village square. Their expressions were controlled, but their pace decidedly purposeful. This alone was enough to stir the villagers into fresh ripples of chatter. Nora Blackwell, emerging from the baker's with a loaf tucked under her arm, intercepted them with the precision of a person who positions herself deliberately in the path of knowledge. "Inspector," she called out brightly, "I do hope you'll be speaking to everyone. It's important that all information be properly collected. I told Sergeant Briggs this morning." "Yes," Armitage said, politely but firmly cutting her off. "Sergeant Briggs mentioned you had insights." Nora straightened with pride. Indeed, I happened to overhear, well, not overhear precisely, but one does pick up on tension. Mr. Channing was not a man universally liked, and certain younger villagers may have found themselves at odds with him. The inspector studied her with a neutral expression. Is that so? And which villagers would those be? Nora paused, clearly enjoying the pause itself. Young Peter Lyle, for instance. He and Mr. Channing were seen speaking quite sharply not too long ago. Miss Marple, who had strolled close enough to hear without appearing to eavesdrop, noted the flicker of triumph in Nora's eyes, an expression that, in her experience, seldom belonged on the face of an innocent observer. The inspector made a brief note. "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwell," she supplied quickly. "Nora Blackwell. I do try to assist where I can." "Of course." Armitage nodded and moved on. Nora watched him go with barely concealed satisfaction until she suddenly noticed Miss Marple nearby. Her expression tightened. "Oh," she said, forcing brightness into her tone. "Miss Marple, I didn't see you there." "That often happens," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "People tend not to notice what they do not expect." Nora blinked, uncertain whether that was a rebuke. "Such a difficult time for the village," Miss Marple went on. "I'm sure you, being well informed, must find it something of a burden." Nora lifted her chin. "I merely share what I know." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, "though sometimes what we think we know is shaped more by fear or pride than by fact." Nora stiffened but said nothing, offering only a thin-lipped smile before clicking away toward the greengrocer. The inspector, meanwhile, had reached Peter Lyle's home. Miss Marple could see the young man standing at his gate, wringing his cap between nervous hands as Armitage questioned him. Peter answered earnestly, nodding rapidly, his shoulders hunched as though braced for accusation. His aunt, white-haired and delicate, stood behind him, hovering like a small protective bird. Miss Marple watched the exchange closely. Though she could not hear the words, she could sense the dynamics. Peter had the look of someone weighed down, not by guilt, but by fear of being misunderstood. His aunt's protective stance spoke volumes as well. People in villages protect their own, Miss Marple knew. Sometimes too quickly, but only when they believe harm is being unfairly directed. The inspector eventually moved on, heading toward Dr. Fenton's surgery. Lydia Fenton's silhouette appeared briefly behind the curtain, before vanishing again. Miss Marple decided this was the moment to speak with the doctor herself. If he had raised concerns about the death, he must have noticed something specific. Something he had not yet shared with the inspector, or something the inspector had not yet asked the right question about. She excused herself from Adelaide and made her way down the gravel path toward the surgery, arriving just as Lionel Fenton stepped outside for a breath of air. He looked tired, not physically, but emotionally drained in a way that suggested the investigation had touched nerves deeper than he wished to admit. "Miss Marple," he said, attempting a polite smile, "I'm afraid I don't have news. The inspector's just left." "That is quite all right," she answered gently. "I wondered, however, whether you might have a moment. There is something I am curious about." The doctor hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Of course. Come in." Inside the surgery, where the sharp scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, Miss Marple spoke with quiet purpose. "Dr. Fenton, you mentioned to Sergeant Briggs that there were inconsistencies in Mr. Barnes Channing's death. Might I ask what concerned you?" Fenton exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to the back of his neck. "I shouldn't be discussing details, not before the inspectors made his assessment, but yes, there were things that didn't align entirely with a natural collapse." "Such as?" He moved to his desk, pulling out a small notebook. "For one, the angle of the fall didn't match what I would expect from a heart attack while cycling. And there was a faint discoloration around the lips. Not cyanosis, but something else. And then there's the smell." Miss Marple's brows rose slightly. "Smell?" "A bitter almond scent." Very faint. So faint I initially thought I imagined it. But it was there. Miss Marple's knitting bag slipped slightly in her hand. Bitter almonds. There were few substances that could cause such a scent. "And you mentioned discoloration," she said softly. "Yes. And there's another thing. I found a tiny abrasion at the base of his neck. Could be nothing, of course. A scrape from the fall, but—" He trailed off, weighing professional caution against instinct. "But in combination," Miss Marple finished, "it becomes something." He nodded grimly. "If it were poison, the inspector will want toxicology. But these things take time." Miss Marple felt a familiar, subtle tightening behind her ribs. Not fear, but recognition. Poison was a weapon of intelligence, not brute force. A weapon of planning. And Mr. Channing, private, influential, intrusive, would make an excellent target for someone who wished to settle a debt without public spectacle. "Thank you, Doctor," she said, rising. "You've been very helpful, and please, be gentle with your wife. She has had quite a shock." Dr. Fenton blinked. "Lydia? She's frightened, yes. But she'll be all right." Miss Marple gave him a kind smile. "I hope so, dear, for I suspect the village is only beginning to reveal what lies beneath its neat exterior." As she stepped back into the daylight, the inspector's distant voice carried faintly from somewhere further down the lane. Questions were being asked, answers attempted, but Miss Marple already knew that the truth would not be found in official questioning alone. It lay in the glances exchanged, the silences held, the secrets whispered only when one believed oneself unobserved. And with each hour that passed, it seemed increasingly clear that Mr. Channing's death had not been an unfortunate accident at all. Someone had meant for him to die. Inspector Armitage spent much of the late morning making his rounds through the village, but though he asked crisp, well-formed questions, Miss Marple suspected he was beginning to feel the same frustration that often plagued police officers in close-knit communities. Villagers rarely lied outright. Most considered that beneath them, but they hid truths behind trivialities, spoke in evasions, and conveniently forgot anything that might cause discomfort. It was a defense mechanism as old as the English parish system. When he reappeared near the square, his brow was furrowed, his notes fuller but no clearer. He paused beside the war memorial, scanning the street as though hoping the stone lions might offer clarity. That was when he noticed Miss Marple approaching at her unhurried pace. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, straightening. "Might I trouble you for a moment of your insight?" She smiled. "Of course, Inspector. Insight tends to multiply when shared." He gave a dry chuckle. "You strike me as someone who's seen a great deal of human behavior." "I've lived in villages all my life," Miss Marple replied, which is much the same thing as studying human nature under a magnifying glass. He gestured for her to join him near the memorial. "Tell me, do you believe Mr. Channing had enemies?" "Most solicitors do," she said mildly. "Professionally, at least. In my experience, a man who knows private matters of many households is seldom free of resentment. It may be minor resentment or something more developed." Armitage nodded, his gaze drifting toward Nora Blackwell's bakery window. The woman herself stood behind the glass, undoubtedly watching the inspector with the keen attention of someone eager to provide additional information should she be invited. "I've had quite an earful from Mrs. Blackwell," he muttered. "She's certain Mr. Peter Lyle is hiding something." Miss Marple folded her gloved hands. "Mrs. Blackwell is very rarely without certainty." "You doubt her. I doubt certainty spoken too quickly," Miss Marple replied. "It often indicates a desire to shape the narrative before facts can catch up." The inspector pondered this. "You believe she may be diverting suspicion?" "Not necessarily from herself," Miss Marple said gently, "but perhaps from someone close to her, or from a truth inconvenient to her sense of propriety." Armitage's brows lowered thoughtfully. "She mentioned an argument she overheard between Channing and a younger man. But another villager claims to have seen Channing speaking sharply with Mrs. Blackwell herself the day before. 2 conflicts in one day, Miss Marple said softly. It does make one wonder what Mr. Channing was attempting to resolve or provoke. Before Armitage could reply, Peter Lyle himself appeared at the far end of the road, heading toward the grocer's. His posture was tense, his steps uneven. The inspector motioned subtly toward him. He's frightened. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, studying the young man's gait. But not, I think, of justice. Rather of being judged. Peter disappeared into the grocer's, and Armitage exhaled with quiet frustration. No one in this village seems willing to tell a complete story. Bits here, pieces there, and Mrs. Blackwell's contributions seem curated. Miss Marple gave a slow nod. A complete story is rarely offered willingly, Inspector. One must coax it from its hiding places. Just then, a voice called out across the green. Adelaide Burrows hurried toward them, clutching her handbag as though it contained something fragile. Jane, Inspector! Her cheeks were flushed with the thrill of conveying news. Mrs. Welby says the vicar found something unusual near the hedge this morning. A small silver button. He thought it belonged to one of the children, but... Oh, it's better if you see for yourselves. Armitage straightened instantly. Where is the vicar now? In the church hall, Adelaide said, breathless. He's preparing hymn sheets. The inspector nodded his thanks and strode off at once. Miss Marple followed with Adelaide, who continued chattering about the rarity of silver buttons and whether they still adorned modern clothing. Miss Marple, however, was already fitting this new detail into her mental pattern. The vicar was bent over a stack of papers when they entered, but he looked up eagerly. Inspector, I hoped you'd come. Terrible business, all of it. He opened a small paper envelope and held it out. Inside lay a single button, silver, oval-shaped, engraved with a delicate crest. Armitage turned it over in his hand. Found where, exactly? Near the hedge by the lane, the vicar explained. Quite close to where poor Mr. Channing fell. I spotted it early this morning when I was cutting through to the rectory. Do you recognize the crest? The vicar hesitated. It seems familiar, perhaps from some older garment. A coat, maybe. Miss Marple leaned in gently. Might I see it for a moment? The inspector placed it in her palm. It was heavier than expected, and the engraving, 2 interlocking initials surrounded by a wreath, had the unmistakable flair of a tailor who catered to old families. She smiled faintly. Yes, I believe I recognize it. Armitage looked at her sharply. From whose garment? A gentleman's coat, Miss Marple said softly, and not a particularly old one. Colonel Davenport has one quite like it. Adelaide gasped. Colonel Davenport. But Jane, he was carrying tartlets at the fete. Indeed, Miss Marple said, but before the fete, he might well have been elsewhere. And he is fond of wearing that dark navy coat with silver buttons, even on warm days. Armitage frowned. Are you suggesting the colonel was near the lane shortly before Channing died? I am suggesting, Miss Marple corrected gently, that one of his buttons was. Before the inspector could press further, the vicar, already distressed by the implications, wrung his hands anxiously. Colonel Davenport is a pillar of this community. Surely he wouldn't. Miss Marple laid a calming hand on his arm. Finding the button does not mean he did anything wrong. It simply means he was near the hedge yesterday. That could have any number of explanations. But in her mind, she added another thought entirely. People like Colonel Davenport, men of rank, pride, and rigid sense of self, could find themselves entangled in troublesome disputes when matters of honor or reputation arose. Armitage stepped toward the door. I'll speak with him at once. But Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on his sleeve. Inspector, may I suggest something? When you question Colonel Davenport, approach the subject indirectly. Men of his temperament respond poorly to blunt accusations. You may learn more by observing his reaction to the existence of the button rather than presenting it outright. Armitage hesitated, then nodded. Very well. I'll tread carefully. As he departed, Adelaide whispered urgently, Jane, do you truly think the Colonel, of all people, might be involved? Miss Marple looked down at the silver button resting in her palm before returning it to the inspector's envelope. I think, she said thoughtfully, that people are rarely what they seem when pride is at stake. And Colonel Davenport is not a man who tolerates challenges to his authority. She paused at the doorway, watching the inspector approach the Colonel's house across the green. Mr. Channing may have handled his affairs, she added softly, and a man's affairs sometimes conceal more than his public demeanor suggests. But even as she said it, she felt the faintest prick of intuition, something still missing from her developing pattern. Colonel Davenport might have been near the lane, but proximity alone did not make him the architect of murder. No, Miss Marple thought, stepping back into the sunlight, the truth was deeper still. And the village, with all its careful manners and quiet secrets, was slowly revealing the fault lines beneath its calm exterior. Inspector Armitage crossed the green toward Colonel Davenport's house with the kind of purposeful stride that inevitably alerted the villagers. Curtains lifted at the gentlest touch of fingertips, silhouettes shifted behind frosted glass. Even before the inspector reached the Colonel's doorstep, half the village knew precisely where he was headed, and the other half was forming theories about why. Miss Marple, standing beside Adelaide Burrows near the church gate, observed the quiet ripple of anticipation. Gossip, she reflected, was much like wind across wheat. Every stalk bent in the same direction, though each believed it had chosen its own movement. Colonel Davenport answered the inspector's knock almost immediately, wearing his habitual expression of officious dignity. His moustache bristled with affronted importance even before a word was spoken. "Inspector," he barked, "I suppose you're here about that unfortunate business yesterday. A great shock, of course. Terrible for the village." Armitage inclined his head politely. "Just routine questioning, Colonel. Might I come in?" The Colonel stepped aside with a grunt and led him into a sitting room filled with military prints and polished brass. Miss Marple, watching from across the green, could not hear the conversation, but she saw its shape. The Colonel clenched his fists more tightly than necessary, gestured pointedly toward the window as though asserting dominance over the view, and stiffened with indignation at several intervals. The inspector, to his credit, remained calm, his questions seemingly simple. Miss Marple could almost imagine them. "Where were you yesterday morning? Did you see Mr. Channing at any point? Did you happen to walk near the lane?" But then came the moment she had been waiting for. Armitage reached into his coat and produced something. He didn't yet show it, only mentioned its discovery. The Colonel's posture changed abruptly. His back straightened, his face flushed, and one hand drifted instinctively toward the front of his coat, where a missing button would have resided. To a stranger, the movement might have meant nothing. To Miss Marple, it spoke volumes. "Ah," she murmured quietly to herself. "So it is your button, Colonel." But a missing button alone did not signify guilt. It only meant that he had been near the hedge, which aligned with her earlier suspicion. What mattered was why he had been there, and whether he would admit it. Inside the house, Davenport seemed to wrestle with himself before presenting an explanation. He gestured toward the mantelpiece, speaking rapidly. Miss Marple knew that type of explanation well. A prepared story, hastily adapted to a new circumstance. When Armitage finally left the Colonel's residence, he looked neither satisfied nor fully skeptical, merely thoughtful. The sort of thoughtfulness that precedes a shift in perspective. Miss Marple met him halfway across the green. "Colonel Davenport was accommodating?" she asked gently. "He was forthcoming," Armitage replied carefully. "Claims he lost the button days ago and that he walks the hedge path often. sometimes to take the air before breakfast." "Reasonable enough," Miss Marple said. "Except that the button was discovered directly beside the site of the fall, and the Colonel is a man who prides himself on immaculate appearance. He would notice a missing button immediately." Armitage's jaw tightened. "Yes, that crossed my mind as well." "More importantly," Miss Marple added, "he was clearly rattled when you mentioned the find. Colonel Davenport is not easily rattled." "Meaning?" "Meaning," she said gently. "The Colonel is hiding something, but not, I think, murder. He is hiding embarrassment, the sort of embarrassment that could tarnish a reputation built over decades. Something he'd much prefer to keep from becoming village gossip." Armitage exhaled, half frustrated, half admiring. "You see these things with astonishing clarity, Miss Marple." "Experience," she replied modestly. "It teaches one that pride is often easier to trace than guilt. The Colonel's pride will guide you to the truth of his whereabouts, but not, I suspect, to Mr. Channing's killer." Before Armitage could respond, a sharp cry pierced the quiet afternoon. "Inspector, over here, quickly!" It was Peter Lyle running from the direction of the post office, face pale, hair disheveled, the picture of a young man pushed beyond the limits of anxiety. Armitage hurried toward him, Miss Marple following close behind. Peter held a small envelope in trembling fingers. This was in my aunt's letterbox," he stammered. "Just now. No stamp. Someone delivered it by hand." Armitage took the envelope, opened it carefully, and drew out a single folded sheet. Miss Marple watched his expression shift, from curiosity to confusion to sharp, startled alarm. "What is it?" Peter choked out. "Is it about Mr. Channing?" Armitage stiffened. "Where is your aunt now?" "At home," Peter said. "Resting. She's been poorly." "I'll need to speak with her at once," the inspector said, already moving. He handed the note to Miss Marple. "Read this. I think you'll understand my urgency." Miss Marple unfolded the paper delicately. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, unmistakably tidy. Exactly the sort of hand a solicitor might have favored. But the content was far more troubling. "You think yourself safe, but you are involved more than you know. What happened on the lane was not misfortune. Speak of that morning, and the truth will come out. For you, as well as for me." No signature, only a final line, underscored twice. "Remember the cottage." A soft frown crossed Miss Marple's face. The word cottage in Little Wharton could refer to many residences, but when paired with implied scandal, urgency, and secrecy, Old Mill Cottage came to mind at once. Peter's aunt's property, and the very cottage whose sale Mr. Channing had been handling. Miss Marple folded the note again, each crease precise, her thoughts aligning with equal tidiness. "Inspector," she said quietly, "you must be careful with Peter's aunt. This note suggests someone believes she knows more than she does, or hopes to frighten her into believing so." Armitage nodded grimly. "That was my reading as well." She slipped the note back into his hand. "But there is something else here. Something crucial. Whoever wrote this understood that fear can be more persuasive than accusation, and only someone with intimate knowledge of village affairs, and Mr. Channing's dealings, would know which cottage to reference." Peter looked from one to the other, terrified. What does it mean? What truth is he talking about? Miss Marple's voice was soft, steady. "It means, my dear boy, that someone in this village is desperate enough to threaten an elderly woman who has done nothing but trust the wrong people." She paused, eyes drifting toward the cluster of houses at the lane's far end. "And desperate people," she added, "are often the ones who make mistakes." Armitage straightened, determination setting his features. "Then we find the writer." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "But first, we must learn what happened at Old Mill Cottage that none of you have yet thought important." The inspector nodded sharply and headed toward Peter's cottage. Miss Marple followed, her steps steady, her mind already tracing the path the killer had taken. The picture was still incomplete, but a corner piece had just revealed itself, and once the corners were found, the rest would surely follow. Peter hurried ahead of Inspector Armitage, leading him and Miss Marple down the narrow lane that wound toward Old Mill Cottage. The hedgerows pressed close, as though trying to overhear their hurried footsteps. Miss Marple kept pace with surprising steadiness. She had long ago learned that mysteries unfolded best when one walked just slowly enough to notice what others missed. Peter's cottage came into view, a small, tidy home with climbing roses framing the door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and coal smoke. His aunt, Mrs. Winifred Lyle, sat in an armchair near the window, her posture stiff, her expression a mixture of confusion and dread. "Aunt Winnie," Peter said gently, kneeling beside her. "The inspector needs to speak with you. It's about the note." Her thin hands tightened around the arms of her chair. "I don't understand it," she whispered. "I've never been mixed up in anything improper. Why would someone write such a thing?" Inspector Armitage crouched beside her with unexpected kindness. "Mrs. Lyle, we're not accusing you of anything. We simply want to understand whether you recall anything from yesterday, or any dealings with Mr. Channing, that might help us." She shook her head weakly. "I hardly saw Mr. Channing at all these past weeks. He sent letters about the sale of the cottage, that's all. He said buyers were interested. Though these days I wonder if he told me the truth. But as for that morning," her voice wavered, "I never left my bed until after breakfast." Miss Marple stepped forward. "Perhaps, dear, the note was meant to frighten you. Your family home, Old Mill Cottage, has been in question. People sometimes use fear when they want to shift suspicion." Mrs. Lyle looked at her with wide, watery eyes. "But I don't know anything. Truly, I don't." "I believe you," Miss Marple said warmly. "But perhaps someone believes you know something, or fears that the process of selling the cottage placed you closer to a secret than you realize." Armitage unfolded the note again. "Do the words, 'Remember the cottage,' mean anything to you?" Mrs. Lyle pressed a trembling hand to her forehead. No, nothing at all." Yet something in her tone, something faintly uncertain, gave Miss Marple pause. Not deception, but a memory half-formed, like a shadow flickering at the edge of thought. Before Miss Marple could pursue it, a knock sounded at the door. Peter answered, revealing Lydia Fenton, breathless and pale. "Oh, Peter, Inspector," she said, flustered. I hope I'm not intruding." Armitage frowned. "Is something the matter, Mrs. Fenton?" Lydia wrung her hands. "They're saying, well, people in the village are talking. They're saying the colonel is being questioned, and that Peter's aunt received a threatening note." I wasn't sure whether to come, but her eyes darted to Miss Marple. "I thought you might want to know something. Something about Old Mill Cottage." A hush fell. Even the ticking clock seemed to pause. Miss Marple's voice softened. "What is it, my dear?" Lydia glanced nervously at Mrs. Lyle, then back at the inspector. "I didn't realize it might matter until this morning. Yesterday, just before the fete, I saw Mr. Channing leaving the path that leads behind Old Mill Cottage." The inspector straightened. "What time was this?" "Perhaps an hour before the fete began. I was walking to the surgery to meet Lionel. I saw Mr. Channing coming from the direction of the mill stream. He looked flustered, and he was carrying a small leather folio." Armitage exchanged a quick, significant glance with Miss Marple. "Did you see anyone else nearby?" Lydia hesitated. I'm not sure, but I heard voices. I think 2 men were arguing. I only caught a few words. Nothing clear, but I'm certain one voice was Miss Channing's. And the other," the inspector pressed. She shook her head. "I don't know." But Miss Marple noticed Lydia's eyes flicker, just briefly, in the direction of Mrs. Lyle before she quickly looked away. "Interesting. Very interesting." Peter's aunt clasped her hands tightly. I never heard any voices, and I was home all morning. Miss Marple stepped slightly closer to her chair. My dear, the cottage is old. Thick walls. It's not surprising you might miss noises outdoors. Mrs. Lyle nodded shakily, though her eyes remained clouded with worry. Lydia, still pale, added, there was something else. When Mr. Channing saw me, he startled, as though he hadn't expected anyone to be nearby. He tucked the folio under his arm quickly. Too quickly. A folio? Armitage repeated. Did you notice anything distinctive about it? It was brown leather, worn around the edges, the kind solicitors use for sensitive documents. Mrs. Lyle gave a soft gasp. But Mr. Channing said he kept all the cottage papers at his office. Miss Marple felt the faint click of another puzzle piece sliding into place. Armitage rubbed his jaw. If he removed documents connected to Old Mill Cottage, and someone met him there, someone who doesn't want those documents exposed, then the note to Mrs. Lyle begins to make rather more sense, Miss Marple finished. Peter's face drained of color. So whoever met Mr. Channing there might be the person who killed him. It's a possibility we must consider, Armitage said grimly. Lydia stepped closer to Miss Marple, lowering her voice. Do you think the argument by the mill could be connected to the document he wanted me to sign? I can't help feeling he was entangled in something larger than any of us knew. My dear, Miss Marple replied softly, it is increasingly clear that Mr. Channing lived a life entangled in many things, and some threads, when tugged, lead to places people would rather keep concealed. Armitage closed his notebook with a decisive snap. I'll need to examine Old Mill Cottage at once. Mrs. Lyle, is there anyone else with a key? No, she whispered, only Peter and I. Then I'll ask you both to accompany me. Miss Marple, your insight has been invaluable. Would you care to join us? Miss Marple smiled gently. I think it may be quite necessary. The small group stepped into the lane once more, leaving the cottage and its trembling occupant behind. As they walked toward Old Mill Cottage, villagers watched from afar, the hum of speculation rising again like distant bees. Lydia, walking beside Miss Marple, spoke under her breath. I shouldn't have waited to tell you. I was afraid it wasn't important. My dear, Miss Marple said kindly, small things are often the most important. Ahead of them, the mill cottage appeared, its windows dark, its thatched roof sagging slightly, its garden overgrown as though attempting to hide itself from view. And as Miss Marple approached, the faintest shiver of intuition ran through her. Whatever had happened on the lane had not begun there. It had begun here, at this quiet old cottage, and the truth, she felt certain, was waiting just behind its closed door. Old Mill Cottage stood at the far end of the lane as though deliberately distancing itself from the rest of Little Wharton. The air around it felt still, too still, Miss Marple thought, as if the trees and hedges nearby were holding their breath in anticipation. The garden was overgrown, the path half swallowed by tall grasses, and the once white door bore the faint green traces of weather and time. It did not present danger exactly, but something more subtle, the unmistakable sense of neglected secrets. Peter unlocked the door with shaking hands. It's been empty for months, he murmured. Aunt Winnie hasn't had the strength to keep it up. Inspector Armitage stepped inside first, his expression alert, his boots crunching softly on the dusty floor. Miss Marple followed, taking in the cottage with a careful, sweeping glance. The interior smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something metallic and sharp beneath the surface. She had learned long ago not to ignore such scents. The inspector surveyed the room. No sign of disturbance at first glance. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Disturbances in villages seldom look like overturned furniture, Inspector. They tend to hide in places where only familiarity reveals the difference. She drifted toward a small writing desk pushed against the wall. Its top was bare, but a faint rectangular outline in the dust suggested a missing object, something recently removed. "Inspector," she said quietly. Armitage joined her, his eyes narrowing. Something sat here. Something the size of a folio. Peter inhaled sharply. "The folio Lydia mentioned?" Miss Marple nodded. "Likely. Mr. Channing must have placed it here at some point, but now it's gone." Armitage straightened. "Meaning someone came here after he did." "Or met him here," Miss Marple amended gently, "and left with the folio." The inspector moved through the cottage with growing tension, examining footprints on the dusty floorboards. "2 sets," he murmured. "One light, likely Mr. Channing's cycling shoes. The other heavier, larger, a man's boot." Peter paled. "Colonel Davenport," he whispered. Miss Marple shook her head at once. "No. The prints are broader, and the colonel's boots leave a distinctive heel wear. He favors his right side slightly from an old injury. These prints are evenly weighted." Armitage studied her with quiet respect, then continued his examination. The other man, the one Lydia overheard arguing with Channing. Peter swallowed hard. "But who?" Miss Marple bent slowly to the floor, lifting a small scrap of fabric caught on a protruding nail. Dark wool, thick, high quality. Torn from a garment not by accident, but by haste, a hurried movement, perhaps during an argument. Armitage reached for it. "Let me see." But Miss Marple kept her grip a moment longer. "Tell me, Inspector, have you questioned Dr. Fenton today?" The inspector blinked. Not yet. There was no indication he was involved. "Not involved," Miss Marple corrected softly. "But present, perhaps, in ways not yet obvious. He walks this lane often, and his practice puts him in contact with many private concerns. His wife was frightened of something Mr. Channing implied. And this fabric," she held it up to the light. "This is from a coat finer than the colonel's, finer than anything Peter owns, but just the sort Lionel Fenton wears in cooler months. A handsome navy coat with a wool blend." Peter looked stunned. "Dr. Fenton, but he's so proper." Miss Marple gave a sad, knowing nod. "Proper men often carry burdens no one sees. Sometimes those burdens make them desperate." Armitage frowned deeply. "We will speak with him at once. But let's finish here first." They moved into the cottage's back room, a small space overlooking the mill stream. Dust motes danced in the slanted light. Near the window sat an overturned stool. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on its position. "It didn't fall naturally," she murmured. "Someone knocked it in haste." Armitage crouched beside it. Perhaps during the argument, if Channing was threatened, or if he threatened someone, Miss Marple added quietly. "Remember Lydia's account. He had become forceful, coercive. A man like that, holding sensitive documents, might push too hard." Peter rubbed his forehead. "But why here? Why the cottage?" Miss Marple looked toward the small hearth, where ashes, long cold, still clung in the grate. "Because Old Mill Cottage holds more history than anyone has yet explained." Armitage moved toward the hearth. "You think something was burned?" "No," Miss Marple said. "Not burned, hidden." She pointed to a loose brick near the floor. Armitage pried it free with effort. Behind it lay a narrow recess, and inside a folded sheet of thick parchment. The inspector carefully removed it. It was a legal document, a deed. Old, but updated recently with notations unmistakably in Mr. Channing's meticulous handwriting. Peter stared. "That's the original deed to the cottage? But why hide it here?" Armitage unfolded it fully and stiffened. "Good Lord. What is it?" Peter whispered. Miss Marple stepped beside the inspector. Her eyes traveled over the faded ink, the signatures, the amendments, and then she understood. "Peter," she said gently, "your aunt does not own Old Mill Cottage outright. She never did." He blinked. "But She inherited it from my grandfather. Yes, Miss Marple agreed softly. But your grandfather never had clear title. The cottage belongs jointly to another family, and the co-owner's rights were never extinguished. Mr. Channing must have discovered this when preparing the sale. Armitage's voice was low, urgent. And the co-owner, according to this, is Lionel Fenton's late father. Peter's breath caught. Dr. Fenton owns half the cottage? Legally, yes, Miss Marple replied. But Mr. Channing, knowing this, likely intended to use it as leverage. Perhaps to pressure Lydia about the document she was urged to sign. Armitage looked grim. So Lionel Fenton had motive, strong motive. If Channing threatened exposure, Lionel might fear scandal, Miss Marple finished, especially if the cottage rights implicate him in mishandled financial responsibilities inherited from his father. Before they could speak further, footsteps sounded on the path outside, heavy, rapid. Lydia Fenton burst through the doorway, face pale with terror. You must come quickly, she cried. It's Lionel. He's gone to the lane. He said he needed to set something right before it was too late. I'm afraid he'll do something dreadful. Armitage rushed past her. Where did he go? To the bend near the hedge, she gasped, where Mr. Channing fell. Miss Marple exchanged a single, weighted glance with the inspector. Everything, every thread, was converging on that lane. The truth, long hidden, was about to surface, and someone, perhaps on the brink of ruin, might be ready to do anything to keep it buried. The inspector reached the lane at a near run, the sound of Lydia's frantic steps close behind him. Peter followed in confusion and fear, while Miss Marple, though moving more slowly, kept her eyes alert and attentive. She knew that the lane, with its deceptive calm and filtered sunlight, was now the stage for the most delicate moment of truth. Lionel Fenton stood near the very spot where Mr. Channing had fallen, his back turned, shoulders tight with a mix of dread and desperation. His coat, navy wool, with a small tear near the hem, fluttered faintly in the afternoon breeze. When he turned and saw the inspector, his face drained of color. I didn't want you all here, he said hoarsely. I needed to think before anything was said. Dr. Fenton, Inspector Armitage said firmly, we need you to step away from the lane edge. No one is accusing you of anything, but we must speak plainly. Lionel's eyes flicked to his wife. Lydia trembled, hands clasped tightly at her chest. Lionel, she whispered, please, just tell them. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice gentle, steady. Dr. Fenton, you cannot repair what has happened by standing alone on this lane. Come away from the place where fear clouded your judgment. Come back to where truth may still do some good. Lionel closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they glistened with pain. Slowly, he stepped toward the group. I didn't kill him, he said, breathless with the weight of the admission. I swear it, but I was here. I argued with him, and everything that happened afterward was my doing, though not in the way you think. Inspector Armitage's voice was calm, measured. Tell us exactly what took place. Lionel exhaled shakily. Channing summoned me here early yesterday morning. Said he had discovered something irregular in the old deeds of this cottage. Something that could be a scandal for me, for my father's memory, for Lydia. He implied that unless I cooperated, unless Lydia signed the document he wanted, he would expose everything. And what did he want her to sign? Miss Marple asked quietly. Lionel's voice cracked. A transfer of liability for a past patient's damage claim, something he said my father mishandled before his death. But I checked the records. There was no such claim. It was a fabrication. He was using falsified leverage to pressure us. Lydia gasped softly. Miss Marple placed a hand on her arm. I confronted him here, Lionel continued, face pale. Told him I knew the claim was false. He laughed, actually laughed, and said he had other ways to make things difficult for us. He said he already had the signatures he needed to force proceedings. Proceedings involving Old Mill Cottage, Miss Marple murmured. Lionel nodded. He wanted to use it to tie me into debt negotiations, said he could redistribute interest if I played along. I refused. We argued. I pushed past him to leave. He looked down, ashamed. He stumbled then, not from force. From anger, I think. Or surprise. He dropped his folio, but he wasn't hurt. Miss Marple observed him carefully. His remorse was real, yet it did not hold the final piece of the puzzle. "Dr. Fenton," she said softly. "Mr. Channing did not die here. He died later on the lane with traces of poison." Lionel's head snapped up, horrified. "Poison? I never—" "Miss Marple, I didn't harm him." "No," she said gently. "I believe you did not. But someone took advantage of your argument. Someone who found Mr. Channing vulnerable both personally and physically." All eyes turned to the lane as a second figure approached slowly from the direction of the village. Nora Blackwell. Her immaculate hairdo slightly disheveled, her face pale but set in rigid determination, Nora stepped into view like someone who had rehearsed her entrance repeatedly in her mind. Inspector Armitage stiffened. "Mrs. Blackwell, what are you doing here?" Nora looked directly at Miss Marple, and for the first time her expression cracked, revealing the anguish beneath. "You already know, don't you?" she whispered. "You always know." Miss Marple met her gaze kindly. "I know that pride and fear can drive people into dangerous corners, Mrs. Blackwell. And I know that Mr. Channing held something over you as well." Nora's hands trembled as she clasped them together. "He was going to expose me, over something that happened years ago, something I thought long forgotten." Peter stepped forward. "What could he possibly—" Nora broke, her voice shattering. "My brother, before he emigrated, he forged signatures, several of them, on loan applications. Channing discovered it. He covered it up. For a price. I paid him year after year, and now he wanted more. Too much. He said he would drag my family through scandal if I didn't comply." Miss Marple nodded softly. "And so when you found him yesterday morning, shaken and angry after his argument with Dr. Fenton, you followed him to the lane." Inspector Armitage's voice was firm. "Mrs. Blackwell, did you administer poison to Mr. Channing?" Nora swallowed, her composure dissolving. "I didn't mean to kill him. I only meant to frighten him. I brought the tincture, almond extract, mixed with bitter compounds I had for baking. Strong ones. I dabbed a bit onto a handkerchief and pressed it near his face when he stepped off his bicycle to speak to me. I meant it to stun him, to give me a moment to warn him I wouldn't be bullied anymore. But he reacted so quickly. He collapsed. I panicked. I tried to lift him, but—" Her voice broke entirely. He was gone. Lydia covered her mouth. Peter stared, stunned. Lionel closed his eyes. Miss Marple stepped closer to Nora, her voice gentle but unwavering. "You acted out of fear, my dear. But fear mixed with desperation can lead to tragic folly. You were not the only one he coerced, but you were the one who believed he would truly ruin you." Nora sank to her knees, sobbing into her hands. "I didn't want him dead." "I know," Miss Marple said softly. "But intent cannot undo harm, and now the truth must be faced." Inspector Armitage signaled to Sergeant Briggs, who had followed at a distance. Briggs approached solemnly, placing a hand on Nora's shoulder before escorting her away. As they disappeared down the lane, the quiet returned, heavy but honest. Lydia leaned against her husband, tears glistening. "Lionel, I thought the worst." He held her tightly. "It's over now." Peter exhaled a long, shaken breath. Aunt Winnie will be relieved she wasn't involved at all. Miss Marple smiled gently. Goodness, yes. She simply had the misfortune to own a cottage with a great deal of history. Inspector Armitage turned to Miss Marple with deep respect. You saw what none of us could. Every thread. Miss Marple shook her head modestly. Not every thread, Inspector, only the ones human nature always provides. Pride, fear, resentment, and the quiet truths that people reveal when they think no one is listening. Armitage nodded. Still, we owe you a great deal. Miss Marple folded her hands serenely. One does what one can. And now Little Wharton can return to its peaceful routines, though I dare say things will be a touch quieter at the bakery for some time. The inspector allowed himself a small smile. Indeed. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered at the spot where Mr. Channing had fallen, her gaze soft but thoughtful. Human nature, she murmured to herself, is rarely tidy, but the truth, once found, has a way of restoring order. And with that, she turned toward the village, ready for tea and a peaceful afternoon, knowing full well that peace in village life was always only temporary.